Hello and welcome to Metabolic Entanglement. So far in Metabolic Syndrome series, we talked about how chronically high insulin and insulin resistance are the root cause of many different diseases. We also began to cover the basics of human metabolism and the reasons to evolve that way. As in the last episode, we focus on the different types of nutrients and how we convert them into energy. Today we continue the topic of nutrients and we're going to talk about how we store nutrients into our body, which nutrients can we store, where do we store those nutrients, what quantity can we store, and we will also focus on obesity, because excessive accumulation of fat can lead to serious health problems and it's one of the main signs of metabolic syndrome. So, if you're ready, strap your seatbelt and let's roll. Energy Metabolism Part 3: Nutrient Storage and Obesity. As we already said in the previous episodes, our cells are tiny and the space they have is limited. But we store nutrients inside the cells, not outside them. That's why some of our cells had to evolve and specialize in nutrient storage. But before we start talking about those cells, let's see first which of the nutrients can we store. Out of all the nutrients we can store only two, glucose and fatty acids. So if we have to store any other nutrient, first we have to convert it into one of those two. By the way, this is not an accident. Those are the two main sources of energy we have, and they fuel the two main biochemical pathways we use to convert nutrients into energy. But to be able to store more nutrients in less space, our cells have a trick. They convert glucose and fatty acids into more compact storage forms. To do that, they pack together larger amounts of glucose and fatty acids into new forms that take less space. The compact form of glucose is called glycogen. Basically, we have a bunch of glucose molecules that are linked together in long branched chains. That way, we have small grains of glycogen scattered throughout the cells close to all the mitochondria. So, when our cells need some glucose, they can release it from the glycogen and make energy or use it for something else. The main cells that store glycogen are muscle and liver cells. Some other organ cells, such as pancreatic and kidney cells, can also store small amounts, but compared to muscle and liver, the amounts they store are insignificant. In the liver, we can store about 100 grams of glycogen, and that's about 5 to 6% of the mass of the liver. Our liver cells use this glycogen to keep the blood glucose levels steady and to provide the whole body with a constant and even supply of glucose. The percentage of glycogen we can store in the muscles is lower, somewhere around 1%. But because our muscles have much larger mass than our liver, a normal-sized person can store about 400 grams of glycogen there. Of course, the more muscles we have, the more glycogen we're going to store. Our muscle cells use this glycogen only for their own needs. They don't share it with other cells, because this is their quick source of energy. We use it when we have to put in more physical effort. An interesting fact about glycogen and muscles is that glycogen is the secret weapon of professional bodybuilders. When they prepare for a competition, they go through a long time of diet and exercise. They build muscles, they burn subcutaneous fat, but at the end, to really pop out all the muscles, just before the competition, they eat a large portion of food rich in glucose. Usually, it is boiled rice. And this glucose goes into the glycogen stores in the muscles. That way, the muscle cells increase in size and all muscles pop out very well. So, to summarize, glucose can be stored as glycogen mainly in our muscle and liver cells. And in total, we can store about 500 grams of glycogen in our body. But this is very small energy storage for what we need. And if we don't have any other stored nutrients, we're gonna use it for just 1 to 2 days. So glycogen is definitely not the main way we store nutrients. And the main way we store nutrients, of course, is in the form of fat. By the way, fatty acids are usually not found in a free state. And when they are not attached to something else, they are called free fatty acids. But when they are not free, the fatty acids are usually packed in the form of triglycerides. Triglycerides are the main form of the fats. The most fat we consume and store is made of triglycerides. And triglycerides are made of 3 fatty acids attached to one molecule of glycerol. Glycerol, on the other hand, is a molecule made of 3 carbon atoms, which is practically a half molecule of glucose. So our liver cells can easily fuse 2 glycerols together and make 1 molecule of glucose. Practically, when we store triglycerides, we store both fatty acids and glucose. And when we store them in the cells, they stick to each other, because like every fat, they are not polar, so they don't repel other fat. That's why they form fatty droplets, and those droplets are in semi-liquid state, because they are made from both liquid and non-liquid fats. The main cells we store those fatty droplets are, of course, the fat cells. But contrary to popular belief, fat cells are not just small bubbles filled with fat. They are highly specialized cells with many functions. In addition to fat, we store in them fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A, K, and D. We also store cholesterol there, and cholesterol is the main steroid in our body. It is vital for building our cell membranes, for building the synapses in the brain, and we make many hormones out of it, such as estrogen, testosterone, cortisol, and many other things. Also, in the fat cells, we can store in a safe place a variety of harmful toxic substances that we cannot expel from our body. Fat cells also have endocrine functions. They produce many hormones important for the regulation of our metabolism. They also convert on their own glucose and proteins into fatty acids and glycerol and make triglycerides. So that way they help our liver in processing nutrients. They can also change size and shrink or expand when we need it. In addition, they serve as insulation, as the main layer of fat cells in human body is located under the skin, and therefore we call it subcutaneous fat. But perhaps the most important thing about fat cells is that they are not concentrated in a single organ, placed somewhere in the body, but they are scattered all over, under the skin and between the organs and muscles. That way they form fat deposits close to all cells, and that makes the path of the fats from the fat cells to the cells that use them very short. As you can see, fat cells are extremely important for us. Without them, we wouldn't survive all those millions of years of evolutionary pressure. But fat cells are not the only cells we can store fat. The same way we store glycogen in the muscles and organs, we can also store fat there. However, this usually happens when we don't have glucose available. Normally, if we have enough glucose in the food, our muscles and liver prefer to store glycogen rather than fat. But if they don't have access to glucose, then they can also store fat. We developed the ability to store both glucose and fat in the muscles and organ cells because it helped us survive during many stressful situations. That way, no matter what our ancestors were eating, they were always able to have a quick source of energy. In other words, whether we were herbivores or carnivores, to run away from the tiger or to chase the antelope, we definitely needed a quick source of energy. So those of our ancestors who were better at storing nutrients in fat cells, muscle cells, and liver cells had much better chance to survive and reproduce, because they were able to endure longer without food and to deal with stressful situations. On the other hand, the fact that we mainly store fat, not carbs or proteins, is also not an accident, because compared to carbs and proteins, we can extract much more energy from fats. Just for comparison, a gram of fat gives us close to 9 calories, and a gram of carbs or protein deliver about 4. So, from evolutionary point of view, both for us and for all living beings that had to move and carry all their food with them, was much better to store fat, not carbs and protein. Unlike us, plants don't have to move, so they evolved by storing carbs. Even more interesting is the fact that we humans are really good at storing fat. And some scientists are joking that we are the fat primates. Because compared to our closest relatives, gorillas, chimpanzees, and all other primates, who can store maximum about 10% of body fat, we can store much more. Normal weight people have on average between 15 and 25% of body fat, and our newborn babies have more fat than baby seals. And most modern theories about how we evolved and managed to develop and maintain those huge energy-expensive brains suggest that our ability to store more fat was one of the greatest evolutionary advantages we had. But how much fat can we store is a subjective question, because we all have different number of fat cells. In addition, those fat cells may have different capacities on how much fat can be stored in them. Also, each of us has a different threshold of how many new fat cells it can produce and at what rate it can produce new fat cells. In other words, we all have a different fat threshold. This threshold is mostly set by our genes, and there are people on both ends of the spectrum. Some people have unlimited abilities to both store fat and create new fat cells. An example is usually given to metabolically healthy obese people who can store unlimited amounts of subcutaneous fat without having health problems, simply because they have where to store it safely. About 80% of us are somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, and we can store a fairly large but not unlimited amount of fat. And on the other end of the spectrum are those people who cannot store subcutaneous fat at all. It is a condition called lipodystrophy. Those people usually look like they have no body fat at all. And before you start regretting that you don't have lipodystrophy also, it's good to know that they still store fat, but because they have no other choice, they have to store it in places where it's not a good idea to store fat, and they have a lot of health problems because of that. And this brings us to the next topic about the fat that we store in places that are not intended for fat storage. But before we start talking about the problems, it is good to know where the different fat depots are in the body, because excessive accumulation of fat in different fat depots leads to different problems. As we already said, our fat cells are scattered throughout the whole body and are forming several different fat deposits. The main layer of fat in the human body is located in the subcutaneous fat. Ideally, it should be a thin layer of fat cells under the skin of the whole body. This layer keeps us warm and also supplies energy to the whole body, because it is relatively close to all points of the body. We also have visceral fat, with visceral meaning internal, deep. These fat deposits are located in the abdominal cavity and should be a thin layer that surrounds the organs and protects them from collision with other organs, and also directly supplies them with energy. And the last fat deposits are called intermuscular and consist of fat cells that are scattered between the muscle cells, as they supply our muscles with energy. But as we said earlier, fat cells are not the only place where we can store fat. We can also store ectopic fats. Ectopic, translated into normal language, means out of place, so not in the fat cells. These are fat droplets that we store inside the cells of organs and muscles and between the cells of organ and muscles. in places where we shouldn't normally store fat. So, generally speaking, if we need to, we can store fat everywhere. It is quite another question how and when storing more fat can be a problem. We all hear on a daily basis that being overweight and obese is not healthy. But why? No one tells us how exactly being overweight or obese makes us not healthy. And that's because the main data we have on obesity comes from epidemiological studies. And epidemiology is not an exact science. It doesn't show what is the cause of the problem. It only shows the trends. Or, as they say in the scientific circles, shows the risk of developing a disease. You will probably better understand how epidemiology works if I give you an example of a standard epidemiology study. Let's say that the state allocates funds to study the relationship between obesity and cardiovascular diseases. A team of scientists is formed and they select a number of people, let's say 10,000 people, who agrees to participate in the study, of course. And then they follow those people for like 20 years. They examine those people once a year, and that includes measuring weight and height and usually calculating body mass index. But body mass index doesn't always show the correct percentage of body fat, and therefore a big strong guy with 10% body fat can be categorized as obese, or a person with 30% body fat but with normal weight to height ratio can be categorized as normal. Standard blood tests are also made, as they depend a lot on if the person has really been fasting in the past 12 hours, and we all know that this doesn't happen very often. Blood pressure is also measured, which can be completely different only 5 minutes before or after. And also, the patients must fill a form for lifestyle: food, drinks, alcohol, cigarettes, drugs, sports, sleep, and so on and so on. And if you ever have to fill such a form, you will see questions like: do you smoke and how much do you smoke per week? How much alcohol do you have per week? How much meat, how much vegetables, how much sport, etc., etc. But most people don't remember what they ate yesterday, what is there to say for a whole year. And beside that, we don't like to admit when we do something wrong. So quite often the results are, oh, I exercise a lot, barely drink, hardly ever smoke, and I'm eating healthy, especially when others aren't around. That way, most of those studies rely on inaccurate, incomplete, and incorrect data. But this is only the first part of the problem. Problem number 2 is that when the study is done, they see that in those 20 years, say 30% of these 10,000 people had some kind of cardiovascular disease. And let's say that 60% of these 30 and let's say that 60% of these 30% are overweight or obese, which by the way also means that 40% of the people with cardiovascular diseases have normal weight, and the study does not prove a cause but only shows a trend. But that doesn't stop epidemiology people who have spent 20 years on this study, and they declare that overweight people have 60% risk of developing cardiovascular disease. And 60% is the relative risk, not the total risk. The total risk is 6%. Because of those 10,000 people, we have only 600 more people who are both overweight and have some cardiovascular disease. But because it's not scary enough, and no one will pay attention if they publish a risk of only 6%, they usually publish the relative risk, which is 60%. And from here, the media takes the ball. And regardless if they know the difference between relative and absolute risk, and how adequately and correct the study is done, they publish headlines like "obesity kills," "being overweight leads to heart attack," or like scientists prove that obesity causes cardiovascular diseases. And we know they do that because no one would buy their news if they publish a title like "Scientists discover that obesity may be slightly related to cardiovascular diseases." So, as a result, now we all somehow kinda know that being overweight or obese is not healthy and it is the reason for cardiovascular diseases. Generally speaking, these type of studies are sort of a broken telephone game where each participant adds something of themselves, and as a result, we all know things that they may be true or maybe not. Fortunately, not all research is like that. The gold standard are the controlled studies. And here, all patients are in controlled environment, and it is known exactly what they consumed and what they did. We also have new techniques and new technologies to search for the cause of the problem and not just for the risk and trends. And yes, some problems do arise when we start accumulating more fat. If we leave aside the biggest and most obvious problem that overweight people are not sexy, attractive and welcomed in today's society, and we focus just on purely health issues, then the first problem has to do with all the fat cells and is related to their ability to increase and decrease size. As we mentioned earlier, fat cells can increase in size, which allows us, when we need it, to store more fat inside them, as they can easily stretch up to 4 or 5 times their standard size without having any problems. But if we need to store more fat, we have two possible options: to make new fat cells or to stuff more fat inside the fat cells we already have. And we do both those things. We make new fat cells as fast as possible. By the way, they assume this is the greatest advantage metabolically healthy obese people have, because it is considered that they're able to make fast and a lot of new fat cells in the subcutaneous fat depots, which is the safest place we can store fat. And therefore, the fat goes where it should and it doesn't cause any health problems. But if we reach our limit of creating new fat cells, we have only one option: to store more fat inside the fat cells we already have. In that case, the fat cells get bigger and bigger, and they can get up to 20 times bigger than their standard size. But that stretch damages their structures and they start dying. And when cells in our body are dying, they are attacked and destroyed by our immune system. Macrophages and T cells surround those fat cells that doesn't work properly and begin to produce inflammatory toxic substances to destroy them. But these toxic substances don't stay concentrated just there, and they begin to diffuse and spread around. So, the more fat cells are dying, the bigger the inflammatory response is. And if the inflammation got too big, then the toxic substances begin to damage other cells, especially cells in the heart and blood vessels, because they are our transport system and everything moves through them. The longer we have inflammation, the bigger the damage is. So, when the cells of the blood vessels and the heart are damaged, our body is trying to repair them and begins to accumulate calcium and cholesterol in the damaged areas. Calcium gives a hard structure to the blood vessels, and cholesterol sticks to the walls of the damaged cells and plugs the holes. This is the normal way our body repairs itself. But if those inflammation processes are chronic and last like 20-30 years, the damage becomes huge, and we accumulate a lot of calcium and cholesterol. In that case, too much calcium makes our blood vessels stiff and easier to damage, and too much cholesterol clogs them. So at some point, somewhere, something fails and we get a stroke, heart attack, atherosclerosis, arrhythmia. So you can look at it that way. Inflammation for a short period of time is useful because this is how we do repairs. But a chronic inflammation that lasts for many years can create very serious problems. The second problem with piling too much fat is when we do that in the visceral fat. These are the fat deposits that surround the organs in the abdominal cavity: heart, liver, lungs, kidneys, all important things. As we accumulate more fat there, our organs begin to squeeze. That disrupts their functions and makes their work more difficult. And if the fat cells there start dying and creating inflammation, that damages our organs. And the last problem is with so-called ectopic fats. These are the fat droplets we store in other cells and between the cells. Building up more ectopic fat creates barriers inside and between our cells and blocks the free access of enzymes, hormones, and all other substances that the cells need in a matter to function properly. And as we said in the previous episodes, in the part where we talked about diffusion, diffusion is the passive transport that supplies our cells with the substances they need. But if something blocks the free access of substances to the cells, that changes the ratio of substances inside the cells, and it changes the way our cells work. So, as a result, we get malfunctioning organs, hormonal disbalances, and a bunch of other problems. Here is also good to mention something called the athlete's paradox. As we said earlier, we evolved to be able to store both glycogen and fat droplets in our muscles and organ cells, because we can use it like a quick source of energy. But many scientists and doctors are still shocked by the fact that active people who don't consume a lot of carbs and are in a very good physical condition don't store glycogen but store fat in their muscle and liver cells, and they have zero problems with that. For me, it's still very strange how they call something completely normal a paradox. And the answer is very simple. If we store fat in the muscles and organ cells because we're going to use it, and we don't let too much fat there, this is not a problem. But if we store fat there not to use it, but because we have nowhere else to store it, this is a problem. And the more ectopic fat we accumulate, the bigger the problems are. And one more thing. When we talk about visceral and ectopic fat, we must also mention that special category of people that scientists call TOFI. This is an abbreviation of the phrase thin on the outside, fat on the inside. These are people who have normal weight for their height, and visibly they don't look fat, but they have accumulated a large amount of fat inside and around their organs and muscles. According to statistics, there are more TOFIs than obviously fat people. It is estimated that about 30% of world's population are visibly overweight or obese, and about 40% are TOFIs. It is also believed that visibly overweight and obese people are in a better place because they can store more subcutaneous fat. So next time, when you hear them saying that being overweight and obese is bad, think about it. Is it the fat you see, or is the one that is hidden deep inside you? That was all for this episode, and what we need to remember about nutrient storage and obesity is both in conversion of nutrients into energy and in their storage, the whole system is divided in two. We have fats and carbs, fatty acids and glucose, triglycerides and glycogen. The second thing to remember is that we can only store a limited amount of carbs in the form of glycogen in our liver and muscle cells, and that the main way we store nutrients is in the form of fat in various fat depots. The other thing to remember is that each of us has our own personal fat threshold, and that storing too much fat on the wrong places can lead to very serious health problems, the main one being chronically inflammatory processes and hormonal imbalance. So, that was all for today, and now as usual you will hear all the disclaimers. Disclaimers. I'm not a doctor. The content is for informational purposes only and does not constitute medical or other professional advice. I don't work for a food or medical company, and I do not receive funding from any industry. I don't like to use qualifiers like good, bad, healthy, and unhealthy because they can be subjective, misleading, and generalizing. I will try to keep my language as understandable as possible, and at the risk of not being extremely correct, I will try to explain biochemistry in layman's terms. That was all for now. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And if you are interested in the topics we discussed in this video, you can find more information on the YouTube channel of Project Metabolic Entanglement. Thanks again, and bye bye.